Hello, and welcome to another night of Why Can't We Be Friends? We are affiliated with GTX Connect, formerly known as Southeast Community Council, and we are partnered with Dell Community Driven Initiatives. I am here tonight to discuss the unhoused and the myths surrounding people who experience homelessness. Tonight we have with us Patrick Lloyd, and I'm going to let him introduce himself here in a second. As you guys can imagine, this was an extremely difficult panel to recruit for. We had several people who kind of got in touch with us and said that they might be able to do it, and then there would be technology issues or connectivity issues. But we feel very fortunate to have gotten Patrick to agree to come and talk to us. He has a lot of experience, and he is going to be able to have this conversation with us. I really want to give a special thank you to one of our board members, Linda Schaefer, who really made this all happen. So thank you, Linda, for your hard work on that. And with that, I will turn it over to Patrick to introduce himself. After I also point out, sorry, I'm a little rusty. We do have the Slido link in the chat. I think Chuck might have to repost it. He might not, depending on when you guys signed in or if the chat's available to everyone. You can go ahead and click that link, and that is where you can put your questions, or you can vote for questions that have already been submitted. I think we had about 5 or 6 questions that had already been submitted. So if you guys can get in there and put your input into which questions you would like to hear asked, and then we will get this started. So with that, Patrick.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Linda, for the invitation to come chat with y'all this evening. Well, first of all, I just want to be explicit. My understanding from chatting with Kelly and Chuck before y'all arrived was that y'all are used to hearing from folks with lived experience of whatever issue is on the table for the evening. And I just want to be clear that I do not have lived experience living outside. I'm a social worker, and I think the reason I'm here is because until recently, from 2016 until early August, I was a social worker at the Georgetown Public Library. I see Walt maybe here, and I know Walt, and I'm not seeing too many other familiar names, but anyway, so I worked at the library for 5 years, and as some of y'all may know, public libraries everywhere, but Georgetown included, serve a lot of people experiencing homelessness. And so my job at the library was essentially to answer questions or to take questions whose answers lie outside the walls of the library. People come asking about books and computers, you talk to a librarian, you come in with questions about housing, lawyers, Medicaid, that sort of thing. I was really the person who tried to point you in a helpful direction. And so many of the folks that I talked to over the years were experiencing homelessness or housing instability. Before I worked at the library, I worked in child welfare, and before that I worked in Title I middle schools, which basically means schools in which the overwhelming majority of kiddos qualified for free and reduced price lunch. So I've seen housing instability, homelessness, and related issues from a variety of angles, but none of which are lived myself. These days, I've started a new job with the state of Texas Library, not the university, but the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, in a new position called Community Resilience Consultant, where I'm hoping to train public libraries around the state in serving vulnerable people and people in general, and the whole person, not just their information and entertainment needs, but the needs of the whole person, because libraries, like schools, like jails, like hospitals, are really kind of catching vulnerable folks in large numbers. And I also, this semester, I'm also teaching a class at UT at the School of Social Work, which is pretty cool. I've been a social worker for 9 years now, and happy to take those questions now, I think.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to pop over to the Slido application. And one of the first questions that is popping up is, are there shelters in Georgetown?
No. That's an emphatic no. The only shelter that exists in Williamson County is Hope Alliance, which is in Round Rock, and which is an essential service to our community. They work with folks who are victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And certainly there is overlap between survivors and folks experiencing homelessness. But if someone has not experienced abuse or sexual assault, then they don't qualify for that housing. And that's also very limited housing. It's been a while since I chatted with them, but if I remember correctly, they have a limit of like 30 to 45 days that somebody can stay there. And of course their beds are limited, and I don't know exactly what they're doing with COVID these days. I'm glad that somebody asked this question, because over the years, people have kind of come back at me and said, oh yes, there are lots of shelters, and then they'll give me a link like the one I just put into the chat. And unfortunately, the folks who do that sort of thing don't have the full information. So if you click on that link, the Texas Baptist Children's Home, that's for families with children, sometimes kiddos involved in child welfare cases. That's not really available for adults experiencing homelessness. The Housing Authority has a 2-year wait list. I don't know what Sarah's Maternity House is. I don't know what Burnett Senior Housing Opportunities is. Catholic Charities does good work, but they do not have a shelter in town. So I just want to be clear that you can Google shelters Georgetown, Texas, and find answers, but that information is a bit misleading. We do not have any shelters in Georgetown.
So along those lines, and this is just me kind of tacking onto this, I know in some places they might not have shelters, but they have things like group living homes that are really low cost, that are not they're kind of more privately owned. Mm-hmm. That happens a lot. I know from my experience as a counselor in Austin. Does that happen much in Georgetown or Williamson County? Do you have any knowledge of anything like that?
Those things kind of pop up on my radar now and then, and frankly, I don't trust them. The stories I hear from people who have been in those sorts of living situations are basically, those are just scams, frankly. Somebody rents or buys a rundown house and rents rooms out to struggling people, and then kind of washes their hands of the situation. So I could not in good conscience refer somebody to a living situation like that, particularly if they're struggling with sobriety or they have any sort of medical complications. There's no formalized professional group home like the one you're describing that I'm aware of anywhere around here.
Yeah, and my experience with them is exactly what you're saying. They're, very rundown homes with no real leadership on site, no real safety. I mean, nothing like that. It's just kind of like a roof over your head. They don't do maintenance on the homes. They don't do anything like that. So,
right.
So I was just curious about it.
Sure.
If they had something if they have something similar here, but it doesn't really sound like they do.
I suspect that they exist in Williamson County. I think they're those sorts of establishments, if you want to call them that, are not reaching out to people like me, because people like me will realize they're full of it immediately. So I think that they enlist residents via word of mouth around desperate people,
right?
Not social workers and counselors. Yeah.
Yeah, I never knew a social worker who placed anyone in a home like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I wouldn't do that.
Okay, I'm going to go back over to Slido. So this is something that I was aware of. It says, how does the police count policy of dumping the homeless affect the homeless? When I read this, I think of, and I could be wrong, I could be misreading the question, but I think of the Williamson County law enforcement agencies that literally just find homeless individuals in Williamson County and drive them and dump them off in Austin or in Travis County.
Yeah, that's what I hear in that question as well. And I worked for the city for 5 years, and I never got. This is kind of like one of these urban legends with truth to it, right? Like we hear these stories about folks getting dropped off. I know that it actually happened, if I'm not mistaken. The young man who murdered a UT student on campus several years ago was picked up by the Georgetown police, and please correct me if I'm wrong, any of y'all, and dropped off in Austin, and unfortunately went on to kill somebody. Which I want to be explicit in that people experiencing homelessness are more likely to be victims of violent crime than to commit violent crime. That was kind of an anomaly and a really unfortunate incident. But it does seem to be the case that it does happen. And of course, this is not something that the police department is walking around talking about openly. I think it's probably a lot of, my guess would be is that it's officers kind of making an executive decision in the moment and deciding that they think that this is what is best for the community or for this individual. I think that our community has this idea that folks who are struggling, but particularly folks who are experiencing homelessness, need to go to Austin because that's where the resources are. And while in some ways that's true, I would also say that the resources in Austin are inadequate as well. And when we say those sorts of things, we're telling someone that they can't get their needs met in their own community. And so there's oh, you should go to Georgetown where all the resources are. And also like, you should get out of Georgetown, right? And those things are happening at the same time. And so I think that picking somebody up and removing them from their home community, whether or not they have a literal home, a house, is often not what folks want. I've talked to a lot of people over the years living in tough situations and said, there are shelters in Austin and there's stuff available north of here in Temple and Waco. And a lot of folks, they're just like, this is where I live, and a lot of folks who live outside live in Georgetown for a lot of the same reasons the rest of us do, right? It's safe, it's quaint, it's pretty, it's not too big, it's not too small. Just because they don't have a house, it doesn't mean that those things don't appeal to them also. So I think it's really incumbent upon Georgetown to take care of its own, whether that be the issue of homelessness or domestic violence. I mean, we have no shortage of issues that we choose to sweep under the rug, right? I'm sure y'all are well aware of that. So I think that it's time for us to really kind of take a hard look in the mirror and start taking care of our own people.
All right, I'm going to look over at Slido again. What types of services do you think would be most beneficial to the unhoused population? And I guess that's a pretty broad question, but I will just leave it at that.
Low barrier, permanent supportive housing.
Say that again?
Low barrier, permanent supportive housing. So, or no barrier, permanent supportive housing. So I'm using two phrases here, and I'll explain both. So low barrier or no barrier, also known as the housing first model, basically says, if you need an apartment and we have an apartment available, you get it, period. You don't have to be sober. You don't have to have a job. You don't have to be on your meds. We understand that in order to achieve those other things, first and foremost, you need stability in where you sleep at night. So that's the housing first model. That's the low barrier housing model. It doesn't have any rules about what hoops to jump through to get into a house, an apartment, a bed, whatever. Permanent supportive housing in tandem with that is essentially where somebody would be put up in an apartment ideally and provided with a case manager. So a case manager would often be a social worker, counselor, somebody who's professional, and that they kind of do the work that we would hope that friends and family would do for us, right? They check in on you. Are you taking your meds? Did you go to that job interview? How are you feeling today? Do you need to go to your therapist? Did you get your internet set up? All this stuff that kind of, if you think about dropping your kid off at college, right? Like you're trying to make sure they get their computer set up and that they know where the dining hall is and that they know who their professors are and that they're taking care of their mental health and their physical health. So it's a little bit in the same ballpark, but we're doing it for somebody who has potentially been living outside for a really long time. And so that's kind of what case managers do. And in my opinion, and homelessness, as I'm sure y'all are aware, is like a really, really, really tough issue, right? People they get out of it, they go back in, they get out, they get in. And so I think having a case manager is and a place to stay at the same time is super important, because getting over the hump of this problem is really, really difficult, period. And it's super difficult to do on your own, even if you have an apartment, right? How do you navigate systems? How do you get a job if you don't have a driver's license? And then you go to get your driver's license and they say, where's your social security card? And then you don't have your social security card. So trying to navigate all those systems, which are difficult, even for those of us with a lot of privilege and experience in this sort of thing, is even more so for people who may have been living on the margins of society for a long time. So like I said, a housing first model in tandem with permanent supportive housing would be what I would love to see. But Georgetown, politically and I would say from a values perspective, is just unfortunately like light years away from that.
So I kind of guess that goes along with another question that I saw pop up, which was, why don't you think Georgetown has a homeless shelter? And I know I've thought about this before, and I want to hear what you have to say about it, but my first thought is that they don't want them to be comfortable here.
I agree. I agree. I think, well, we spent a long time saying there are no people experiencing homelessness in Georgetown, right? And so we seem to have gotten over that hump somewhat. The city manager's office is aware that homelessness is an issue now, whereas I think, 5 or 10 years ago, we weren't even talking about it. But yeah, I would agree. Folks, kind of the powers that be, whatever you want to call it, the dominant culture of the town just doesn't seem to prioritize the needs of vulnerable people, in my experience. And that to me is a values problem. We have plenty of money to renovate the sidewalks around the square and renovate St. Gabriel Park and put in a new bridge over Northwest Boulevard that no one seems to be using, even though I think it's super convenient. If y'all aren't using it, it's really great. But for whatever reason, we just don't prioritize this sort of thing, which is why I think conversations like this are important. I suspect some of the folks who are listening have heard me give talks like this before. And I think that's one of the most frustrating pieces of all this to me, is that we seem to be in this kind of loop where a lot of the same people have a lot of the same conversations over and over again, and we can't seem to pull more people in to it. And if I knew how to shift the values of a community, I'd be a much wealthier person at this point. But we keep trying, right? I mean, that's why we're here having this conversation.
Right. Another question that popped up kind of toward the bottom that I feel is related to what we're already talking about was how large do you think the homeless population in Georgetown currently is? I mean, and to be clear, a lot of these questions are about Georgetown, and I think they should be asked, and I want them to be asked. But our audience is kind of it can also be about Central Texas in general. Does that make sense? So, I mean, if you can answer the Georgetown question and also kind of maybe give us an idea about what you think it looks like in Austin in comparison, does that?
Sure. So it's, well, let me kind of zoom out for a second. So there, every January, lots of counties around the country participate in what's called the point in time count. And that is usually an evening in January where, and I'll explain why it's in January in a minute, where volunteers, usually affiliated with some sort of centralized homeless services agency within that county, walk literally the county and count the number of people experiencing homelessness. They do it in January because in most of the country, it's cold and people gather in shelters in January. It's a lot easier to count. Williamson County has historically not participated in the point in time count. I think there was a count maybe in the 2000s, and then we did our first one in a long time in 2019. The numbers were really low. I think misleadingly so. Then of course we haven't been able to do one since. I do believe there's one scheduled for this upcoming January, and y'all can feel free to contact me if you'd be interested in volunteering with that. Let me put my email into the chat while I'm thinking about it. So when we counted a couple years ago, I think we only came up with like a few dozen people across Williamson County as a whole. And I'm certain that we have way more people experiencing homelessness than that. I think the problem is that we've been so disconnected from this issue for so long, we don't know where to look. We don't have any shelters. So people are camped out in the woods. You know, the eastern part of the county is still pretty rural. Finding people is really tough. The people who are directing the count, the Texas Homeless Network, are not Williamson County residents, right? So they don't know quite where to look. We don't know quite where to look. It's the first time we had done it. So we've done a really, really poor job. We haven't collected data on this at all. So it's impossible really to say with any kind of certainty. When I think about Georgetown in particular, it also gets tricky, right? Because you're like, okay, well, is somebody who's been couch surfing with friends for 3 years experiencing homelessness? I get yes, but like, are they going to get counted in a process like that as somebody in their car? Do they count? I think if we're talking about people who live in a car or live outside, that I would suspect in Georgetown in a given moment, we're probably talking about dozens of people. That would be my guess. My guess for Williamson County would be hundreds. I don't remember specifically. A quick Google search would probably answer this question for us, but I think Austin is maybe in the 2,000 range, if that sounds about right. But yeah, part of the issue with all of this is that not only we have this values problem, but we don't understand homelessness in our own community, right? We don't know who's here, how many people there are, what do they need, because again, we've just chosen to kind of ignore it. So, I mean, it's kind of compounding problems.
So the next question is, what is the worst myth that you have encountered in people that they believe about homeless folks?
That there are people to be feared, I guess. Well, you know what? I'll even get kind of more basic than that. That they're different. That they're somehow other. I mean, y'all hear me using the phrase "people experiencing homelessness," and as some of you may know, that's person first language, and I encourage you to investigate that. That's kind of like how we might say somebody has cancer versus is a cancer patient, right? And historically these days we say people were enslaved by enslavers. They weren't owned, right? They weren't slaves who were owned. They were enslaved by enslavers. These are people experiencing homelessness. And I think that too often that we have this belief that folks who live outside are somehow other than us, right? And that ends up with people being afraid of people who live outside, people thinking that they should that they're all crazy or violent or to be avoided or lazy or on drug. I mean, like, you know, it goes on and on. And for me, at the foundational level of that is this kind of us and them othering of people. And I think that's, you know, part of that kind of speaks to all of the problems we're talking about, right? Why we don't value folks and why we don't investigate the needs of people and why we don't do the point in time count and blah, 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 because they're other, they're not us, right?
Right. So the next question on here is pretty specific. It says, there was a man who looked Asian who used to spend a lot of time at the library, but I haven't seen him for a while. Do you have any idea what happened to him?
So this fella comes up a lot. And I'm not going to answer that question directly because he, like the rest of us, has the right to his own privacy. And I understand that the question is probably coming from a really good-hearted place, but because people experiencing homelessness are not other, they have a right to their privacy the same as you or I. So I appreciate that person's concern. And like I said, this fella comes up a lot because he does stick out in Georgetown. But I can tell you that he would be extremely upset with me if I were to tell y'all anything about him. And so I'm not going to.
Okay. Okay. So let's see. The next question is, are shelters safe?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Relative to what, you know?
Yeah, right.
Is driving safe? Is eating hamburgers safe? You know, I think again, we all have a right to self-determination. If people feel like a shelter is the best place for them in any given moment, then they should utilize that resource. I think we all have to make assessments, safety assessments of the things that we do. Is a shelter a place where I would want to spend a night? No. Is it a place where anyone wants to spend a night? No, right? Like no one wants to struggle. Nobody wants to live outside. Nobody wants to be addicted. Nobody wants to be impoverished. So, I mean, perhaps the question is, are shelters safer than the conditions that people are coming from? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I think people should utilize that resource. I do think that shelters, actually, maybe the areas around shelters are rather than inside the shelters themselves, are tough places for people to be who have medical issues, who have mobility issues, who are trying to maintain sobriety. Those can be really tough places because there's a high concentration of people who are either actively engaged in substance use or also trying to kick it. So I think it's a risky place for some people, but I think whether it's safe or not is really relative to the situation somebody is trying to exit.
So this question kind of goes along with what some of the things you were just saying, which is, do you think that some people choose to be homeless as a lifestyle?
Yeah, I do. I do think that some people choose it, but it's also I think that there's always going to be a segment of society who just says, I don't want to be a part of the general milieu. And kind of, I mean, I think if you look back through history, there have always been kind of wandering people. But I think that's a hard question to dive into a little bit more deeply, because the resources to get people out of homelessness are so insufficient that a lot of people have spent years and years trying and then they give up, right? So it's like, have they chosen? I mean, are they choosing at this point, if they spent 15 years living on the street trying to utilize resources and those resources have failed them? And that, I mean, in some ways, yes, but in other ways, no, they've just learned that the system doesn't work and they've decided to kind of put their energy elsewhere. So I think is that if we were to have housing first, permanent supportive housing, case management, psychiatrists, job help, all that stuff in every community, what I think we would see is a drastic reduction in homelessness, but that we would not get rid of it completely. So, I mean, the short answer to that question is yes, but I think the longer answer is that nobody chooses to struggle. That if we really valued helping our neighbors, our vulnerable neighbors, that we would see a vast reduction in homelessness.
Okay. The next question is, do you think that there is a difference for like women who are homeless versus men that are homeless?
Definitely. I mean, first and foremost is that being homeless is super dangerous for everybody. And of course, as I'm sure y'all are well aware, the world is even more dangerous for women than it is for men, and even more dangerous for children. And so a lot of women who experience homelessness have kiddos with them. And so those are exceptionally vulnerable families. You know, I spoke to a lot of women who lived in cars and that sort of thing. And you know, and I'm generalizing here, but I think it did tend to look a little bit different. It looked often like couch surfing and like living in cars. I talked to one lady who lived in her car in the Walmart parking lot where she worked 30 hours a week. I like to bring her up because I think it really challenges our stereotypes of folks in this situation. But yeah, I'm certainly concerned for anybody living in this situation, even more so for women and perhaps most so for kiddos.
Mm-hmm. One of the people who contacted me to potentially be a part of the panel was telling me their story, and they were living in their car, and I thought it was interesting because they told me exactly where the car was parked, and I was like, that's so strange that you would tell me exactly where it's located, you know, and I'm not really sure why they included that information. But they were also working. They were working and living in their car because they can't. I mean, how is anybody supposed to be able, especially in Austin now, you know, to be able to afford something like that? So,
right. Yeah. I mean, well, this is maybe not totally related, but it does remind me of a story that I like to share. When I was working at the library, we had someone who was a daily user of the library who lived in their car and had a lot of issues. And in social work, and y'all please take this and use it in your own lives if you like, we have this kind of tool, this kind of trick that we keep in our back pocket. You might call it the miracle question. So when somebody's got a lot of stuff on their plate and you don't really know how to help them because you don't know where to begin, ask, you know, if you went to sleep tonight and one thing changed and you woke up and that one thing was fixed, what would it be? And so I asked this person that question because, like I said, they had a ton of stuff on their plate. And I was thinking that this person was going to say a job or an apartment or, you know, a Hawaiian vacation, right? And they said the brakes on my truck would be fixed. And to your point about working, this is a person who lived in the truck and used the truck to get to work, but the brakes were so messed up that moving the truck was a risky and dangerous proposition, right? They were worried they might hurt somebody. They were worried that they might wreck the truck and then not have a place to live anymore. But because they couldn't move the truck, they couldn't get a job. So to have fix brakes on the truck makes total sense, but it's the kind of thing that I would have never thought of if I hadn't asked this question. So, you know, again, people don't want to struggle, they want to work. Yeah.
So one of the questions on here, is there like any one particular person or story, obviously without saying any sort of names, that kind of sticks out in your mind that you typically talk about or use as an example, or just kind of has stuck with you in general?
Well, I've used a couple already. I think this doesn't answer the question exactly, but I think what is eye-opening to me, having spoken to a lot of folks in this situation, is that how easy it is to fall into it. You know, I get into conversations with people about politics and economics and stuff like that, and I think it can be helpful, unless somebody on this call is surprisingly wealthy. All of us are much, much closer to becoming homeless than we are to becoming billionaires, right? And so when I've talked, you know, I've probably talked to 100 or 200 folks experiencing homelessness over the years, and the things that if they choose to share the things that kind of landed them in that position, they're not wild, right? They're not outlandish things. They're medical bills and losing a job, or substance abuse, right? Like my dad drank himself to death, right? Like a lot of us have dealt with that. I think y'all are talking about that next month. So these, you know, it's not sort of these like outlandish, crazy things that land people in these situations. These are the kind of normal life challenges that just happen to snowball at the wrong time. And I think that that is scary, and I think it should scare all of us about the state of our not only Georgetown but our society, that these sorts of things can happen to most of us.
That kind of goes back to the stop seeing these people as other, you know.
Right.
So I'm looking at some of these questions are kind of related to each other. And there's one in here about Helping Hands of Georgetown. If you're familiar with them, or if you know what's going on with them. There's two different ones. It's one that says, what is the status of Helping Hands? And the other one says something about them building small housing or affordable housing.
Sure.
So you get from there.
I am familiar. So, and apologies to those of you for whom this is redundant, but Helping Hands of Georgetown is a small volunteer-driven nonprofit started by Bob Weimer and his family probably about 4 or 5 years ago. They are modeled after Mobile Loaves and Fishes, who have now grown exponentially and run the Community First Village out near Manor, which I encourage all to look up and visit if you want to. That is a great example of low barrier permanent supportive housing. But Mobile Loaves and Fishes began as a basic needs brown bag lunch handout service. And so that's kind of where, at least last I heard, where Helping Hands is at. They started Monday through Thursday afternoons, I think around 3:15, if I remember correctly. They begin at the library on the 8th Street side, on that the large parking lot. There's a little park bench and a little green space, and they meet there. They give brown bag lunches to anybody who pops by, no questions asked. And then once that demand is met, then they move on throughout the city to hand out more food. I'm not sure exactly of their route. And then they also have a Sunday evening dinner, I think, in that same spot, usually around 4 o'clock. So that's kind of the crux of what they do. the question about tiny homes is that, again, being modeled after mobile loaves and fishes, they had a plan to acquire some land and put tiny homes on that land to house people. And I don't know where they're at with that. I've been, since I changed jobs a few months ago, I've been a little bit out of the Georgetown loop for the past couple months. And of course, COVID didn't help before that. So I don't know where they're at with that, but that was the plan some time ago. So yeah.
Okay. Let's see. I feel like some of these you've kind of already answered. Like one of them says, what attitude needs to change the most in Williamson County to support the homeless? How do you think Georgetown community can best finance the kind of shelter options that the homeless need? I don't even know.
Well, I can answer that one. So this community should not count on the municipal government to fund any of this. I can say that again with certainty as a 5-year employee of the city. They will always, for the foreseeable future, put this back on the community, and they'll say, oh, we have such a great coalition of churches and nonprofits in town, and we really think that they're more than capable of handling that, and basically shirk the issue. So yeah, I wish that I could tell you that there was some sort of, public campaign that could be mounted to allocate city funds in some sort of different way, but just looking at the powers that be, both elected and appointed, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
So they very much feel like it is up to the community itself to address the issues, nonprofits, churches, individuals.
I think they feel that way. I think they also understand that this is kind of a political landmine that they just choose not to step on. I was the first and only helping professional, social worker, counselor, psychiatrist, etc., on city staff. I worked there for 5 years. I never had a meeting with the city manager's office. When I left, they did not replace, they ended my position. So that tells you where they're at, I think.
I think so too. I think you're right. And I think that's very interesting that you were the only helping professional city employee.
First and only, and maybe last.
First and last, right? Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So that answers another question on here that was specifically about the city. And then the last question, this looks like this might be the last question. Do you think a universal minimum income would guarantee or solve the problem of homelessness?
No, but I think it would be a great.
Me too.
Like I said, I think this is an issue that will never be eradicated. But I think that UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a great starting point for a lot of challenges that we're experiencing, homelessness included.
But at least improve quality of life.
Right. I mean, like, I'm a social worker, right? Like, I got it pretty good in a lot of ways, but I'm not a wealthy guy. An extra $1,000 a month would be a real game changer for me. I can't imagine what it would be like for people who don't have a high school diploma, or people who live in their car, or whatever.
They could get their brakes fixed.
Exactly. So I mean, I think about what it could do for me, and I live in a house, a single family home. It would be great for me. I can only imagine how fantastic it would be for people who don't share the same privileges that I have.
Okay, well, that was all of our questions. Is there anything else that you would like to just kind of let the audience know? Any organizations that you want to plug or direct people to? Any projects that you're working on that you want to draw attention to? at this time?
I guess I would say, I always felt like a wet blanket over the years because people would reach out to me and say, can we help? Can we do a coat drive? Can we create hygiene packets and you can give them out and that sort of thing? And again, coming from the goodness of their hearts. And I always felt like a wet blanket because I had no shortage of people offering that sort of stuff. There does seem to be a shortage of people who will knock on their city council person's door, who will knock on their neighbor's door, who will knock on their pastor's door, who will knock on the city manager's door and say, like, frankly, why the fuck aren't you doing anything about this? And so, and I know that that's not a feel-good activity, but I think that's what we need. And so I would just encourage those of y'all who are listening to get out there and hold people's feet to the fire about this stuff. Hygiene packs are great, coats are needed, but what we really need is a shift in the values of this community. And that sort of thing means that we need to pull people into the conversation who are not part of the conversation currently. I read something the other day that said, if you want to change the conversation, change the people who are part of it. And we're not getting anywhere with having the same talk over and over again. Like I said, I've given talks like this many times. And so we got to pull some new people in. And whether that's through charm and humor, or whether that's through holding their feet to the fire, I don't really care. But we got to pull them in one way or the other.
Right. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for coming and having this conversation yet again.
You're welcome.
With a new group of folks. Maybe some of them are new, some of them might not be. And congratulations on your new position.
Thank you.
And yeah, hopefully some of these folks will maybe email you and have some ideas or want more information.
Sure.
And yeah, so that does it for our conversation for this evening. And I think